Have you ever felt like your pain would never be heard? That the world wouldn't understand the scars you carry inside? Those invisible scars no one can see, but that weigh heavily on you every day? Imagine returning home after a war, your body seemingly intact, but your soul in pieces. People smile, pat you on the back, call you a hero, but inside, the silence screams. What do you do when memories won't let you sleep? When every noise transports you back to the battlefield? It's as if the world moves on, and you're stuck in the same place. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt like no one could understand the depth of what you carry? This is a story about pain, but also about transformation. It's about how tears, which seemed useless and endless, can transform into something capable of healing not only those who cry, but also those who listen. Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you. This story isn't just about a soldier returning from war. It's about anyone who carries a weight the world doesn't see. It's about you, who may have tried to put a smile on your face to hide what you're feeling. Each night for him was a silent battle. Each dawn felt like a never-ending battlefield. Nightmares came like invisible enemies. And worst of all, when he woke, no one was there to understand what it meant. His family wanted to see him well. His friends wanted to celebrate his return, but his mind was at war. What do you do when your body is home, but your heart is still on the battlefield? What happens when tears become the only form of communication? When crying is the only sound that conveys what words cannot? It was at this point of darkness that something unexpected happened. It wasn't a magic solution. It wasn't a conversation that changed everything at once. It was a sound, a melody, a simple touch that seemed to come from a place he couldn't explain. Little by little, the music began to open a breach in the silence. Each tear became a word. Each word became a note, and each note became a song. Can you imagine the power of transforming your own pain into something that inspires others? That's what makes this story so powerful. Gradually, writing became more than an escape. It became a means of survival. Each song was a piece of his heart being poured out, a way to organize the chaos within his mind. And the more he wrote, the more he realized he wasn't alone. Other people saw themselves in the lyrics, were moved, and cried along with them. Perhaps this is the power of music. It breaks through walls that ordinary words can't. And that's what begins to transform not just a man, but an entire story. What you're about to hear next could change the way you view your own pain. Maybe it will remind you of moments you've tried to forget. Maybe it will give you the courage to transform your own story into something that inspires others. This journey is just beginning, and in the next step, you'll see how these tears became songs that echoed far beyond the place where they were written. Each song that emerged seemed to open a ray of light amidst the darkness that surrounded him. It was as if, finally, someone was listening to what he couldn't say out loud. Music became a safe place where he could be vulnerable without fear of judgment. And suddenly, what had once been pain began to take on new meaning. Perhaps you felt this too. That moment when something so simple, like a melody or a phrase, seems to convey exactly what you've experienced. It's as if life for a few moments feels less burdensome. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated most with you so far. I'd love to hear how this story resonates with you, because every comment you leave here helps build a space where others can feel welcomed. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who, like you, may need to hear that there is hope even after pain. And since you're here, please like this video. When you like it, YouTube understands that this content is important and shares it with others who also need to hear this message. It's a simple gesture, but it can change the day of someone who's silent and thinking about giving up. If you want to continue walking with me through these deeply moving stories, subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next chapters of this journey, which will bring even more reflections, lessons, and inspiration to transform your own story. Because this journey is just beginning, and what comes next will show how these songs have become more than just words. They have become bridges to other lives, opening paths where there seemed to be no way out. When he finally returned home, everything seemed the same. The same streets, the same neighborhood, the same corner cafe where he used to spend his afternoons before heading to the barracks. But inside, nothing was the same. He felt like he was back, yet at the same time completely out of place. People smiled, shook his hand, and said, "Welcome back," as if the mere act of stepping onto American soil were enough to erase the last few years of combat. But it wasn't. The nights in his small house became long and silent, and the silence was almost deafening. The sound of the wind against the window, the distant rumble of a car passing by on the street, everything seemed to carry an invisible tension. It was as if the world expected him to simply move on, but the weight of what he had seen didn't disappear when he closed his eyes. Each night became a private struggle. When everyone else slept, he lay awake, motionless, staring at the ceiling. The dreams weren't dreams. They were vivid, detailed memories that dragged him back to the front. He could smell the smoke, hear the screams of his comrades, and sometimes wake with his heart racing, as if he were back in the middle of it all. In the morning, he would plaster an automatic smile on his face and pretend everything was fine. But inside, the battle continued. And this is the part almost no one sees. The war doesn't end when the last shot is fired. It continues in the minds of those who survive. His friends tried to cheer him up, inviting him out to have a beer, to tell jokes at the bar. But he couldn't fit into that normality. It was as if I'd been trapped in a place no one else could reach. The ordinary city noises bothered him. The sound of a bursting exhaust made his entire body react as if under attack. He hated it, hated not being able to relax, hated feeling like his own body was betraying him, and at the same time, he hated the idea of telling anyone. How could he explain something he didn't even fully understand? It was in this space of isolation that the tears began to come more frequently. They weren't tears of a single moment, but of years of pent-up feelings. He wondered if he would ever be his old self again, or if that man had remained on the battlefield forever. In the United States, many veterans face this same reality. There is support, yes, but not everyone has the courage to seek it. There's a stigma around admitting you need emotional support, as if it were a sign of weakness, and he carried this extra weight. The family, even without fully understanding, sensed something was wrong. His parents watched from afar, respecting his space but afraid to get too close. His brothers tried to make him laugh, but sometimes they only made things worse, because he felt he was disappointing everyone by not being the same as before. He missed the simplicity of before the war, the Sunday afternoons in the backyard, the smell of barbecue, the leisurely conversations, but now everything seemed distant, as if he were looking into another life. The music he used to listen to before the war no longer had the same effect. What once brought joy now only brought longing. He began searching for different sounds, something that could accompany what he felt, and it was in this process that he found an old notebook and began writing. At first they were just loose words, memories that emerged without order, but little by little, those words transformed into something more, as if gaining rhythm, melody, as if each memory had its own note. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because this is the moment when the pain begins to transform, when what seemed unbearable begins to be released, even if in small pieces. This transition isn't quick or easy. It requires facing painful memories, accepting hidden truths about what happened outside and who you became afterward. It's like walking through an emotional minefield, unsure of where to step. But it's precisely in this process that transformation begins to happen, when you decide you'll no longer live as a prisoner of the past, even if it means feeling everything all over again to move forward. He began to realize he wasn't alone on this journey. As he searched for stories from other veterans, he found similar accounts, people who were also trying to rebuild their lives, dealing with invisible scars. These stories became fuel, showing that it was possible to transform pain into something bigger, something that had an impact. This sense of community, even at a distance, was like a first step out of isolation. It was a reminder that there was still life outside that bubble of memories. Writing became a ritual. Every morning before sunrise, he would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and write. Some pages were harsh, filled with anger and frustration. Others were delicate, almost like a letter to someone who never existed, and somewhere along the way it began to transform into lyrics. Words took on melody, feelings took on sound, and for the first time in a long time, he felt he was creating something beautiful from the chaos he had experienced. This process didn't heal everything at once, but it was like opening a window in a room that had been sealed for years. Little by little, the air began to circulate. Little by little, he began to breathe again, and as the songs took shape, he felt his own life regain its color. It was a lonely but powerful journey, as if he were seeing behind the scenes of his own transformation. Each song was a small victory, proof that there was still something inside him worth listening to. Write in the comments, My pain also has a sound. I want to see who has already transformed or is transforming something difficult into a way to move forward. He tried to return to his routine as if nothing had happened, as if he could simply shut off the most intense chapter of his life and move on. At first, it even seemed possible. He woke up early, went to work, greeted his neighbors, responded to messages in the family group. But inside, everything was out of place. With every step on the street, with every sudden noise, it was as if his body was being reminded that it was still on alert. No matter how hard he tried to appear normal, there was something there that no one could see. An open wound that bled silently. Those around him continued to call him a hero, praising his courage, thanking him for his service. And he smiled, saying, "Thank you." But what he felt was completely different. Inside, the weight of the decisions he had to make, the lives he had seen lost, the scenes etched in his memory, left him feeling shattered into 1,000 pieces. He would look in the mirror and sometimes not recognize his own face, as if he were still that soldier lost amidst the desert dust. This is a truth few have the courage to speak. The uniform may be behind, but the war continues, silently, in the mind. Deep down, he wanted to scream, to tell everything he was feeling, but the words wouldn't come. Fear of judgment silenced him. He knew that many people around him would never understand what truly goes on in the mind of someone returning from a battlefield. It's easier to believe in the image of the hero who overcame everything than to see the man who, at night, struggles to find the strength to carry on. In the United States, where veterans are often seen as symbols of honor and resilience, admitting that you're broken feels almost like a betrayal of the expectations people have of you. The pressure to move on only increased. At family gatherings, someone would always say, "You're strong, you'll get through this," as if it were just a matter of time. But time, for him, didn't bring relief. It only brought more days of silent struggle. This mindset that everything must be resolved alone made him withdraw even further. It was as if he were living two lives, one for the world to see, where he was the strong man who survived, and another that only he knew, full of memories and pain no one could touch. There were days when he would drive for hours, aimlessly, just to try to calm his mind. He passed through small towns, along nearly empty roads, as if searching for a place where he could finally breathe. Sometimes he would park by a lake and stare at the water for long minutes, waiting for his mind to slow down. But peace seemed distant, almost unattainable, and when he returned home, the same silence awaited him, that heavy silence that had become a constant companion. It was in this context that he began to realize how much his life was becoming a series of attempts to escape. He watched TV shows for hours to avoid thinking, scrolled through his phone feed until his eyes hurt, and did anything to avoid the moment when he would have to face his own thoughts. And that's exactly where the danger lies. When you start living on autopilot, letting pain dictate the pace of your life. He knew something needed to change, but he didn't know where to start. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it's precisely at this stage when the pain becomes almost unbearable, that small decisions begin to make a difference. It's in the midst of this internal chaos that transformation begins to show its first signs. Sometimes it's a simple gesture, a word heard at the right moment, a memory that surfaces unexpectedly, opening a door to something new. And, even if he didn't realize it at the time, every tear, every sleepless night, every attempt to reconnect with the world was paving the way for a reunion with himself. The invisible conflict, the one no one sees, was becoming the fuel for something bigger. He didn't yet understand the impact all of this would have, but he already felt he couldn't continue in the same way. It was as if life was pushing him to a decision point, one of those moments when you have to choose whether to continue carrying the weight alone or find a way to transform this pain into something meaningful. Write in the comments, "I know what this silence is like." I want to know who has ever felt this internal war and found, or is searching for, a way to reconnect. He didn't quite realize when he'd reached his breaking point, but one day he realized he was just surviving. His routine had become a cycle of getting up, doing what needed to be done, and waiting for nightfall. But nighttime was the worst. It was during those times that his thoughts came more strongly, that the faces he wanted to forget would reappear in the darkness of his room. He would sit on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, unable to bring himself to turn on the light. It wasn't just sadness. It was a mixture of exhaustion, guilt, and an emptiness that seemed to swallow everything around him. That particular night, everything felt heavier. The house was silent. The clock read almost 3 in the morning. and he couldn't sleep. She looked at her hand and wondered how many decisions she had made during the war that changed the course of other people's lives. The hidden truth he carried was that he couldn't forgive himself. Outside, life went on, but inside it was as if he were still on the same day it all happened. Every memory was an open wound, and each wound had a name, a face, a sound. The cold floor of the room became his only refuge. He lay there, feeling the contrast between the cold of the floor and the heat of his tears. He didn't try to get up. He remained still, as if willing time to pass quickly enough for it to be over. His mind screamed that there was no escape, that no one would ever understand the depth of his pain. It was as if he were trapped inside himself, and for a moment, he actually considered giving up. But at the same time, something inside him refused to completely extinguish that flame. It was a strange feeling, as if there were a tiny voice telling him it wasn't over yet. He clung to that voice with everything he had. This was the first time he realized the magnitude of the battle he was fighting, not against something external, but against his own will to stop trying. And this is exactly where many veterans in the United States find themselves, at a silent crossroads, where they must decide whether to continue carrying the burden alone, or to find a way to transform it all into something meaningful. The dawn crept slowly on. As the sun began to rise, a faint light entered the room through the window. He hadn't slept, but that first glimmer of light brought a sense of possibility. Small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. That was when he realized he couldn't stay that way forever. That was the first decision to change. Not a grand revelation, but a tentative step, almost a whisper. It was time to begin facing what lay behind all the pain. That was the morning he picked up a notebook and wrote a simple sentence, almost a confession. I'm still here. It was as if he wanted to prove to himself that despite everything, life still ran through him. He didn't know exactly what to do next, but that sentence stuck in his memory. It was the first time he had transformed a feeling into something visible, something that could be read and remembered. Now I want to delve even deeper into this, because this breaking point isn't the end, but rather the place where transformation begins. It's as if all the pressure he'd been feeling had finally found an outlet. From that point on, each decision would carry a different weight. He knew that continuing to hide meant losing himself forever, but choosing to face the pain head-on meant opening the door to something new, even if that newness was scary. This was the true turning point, the moment when pain stopped being just a burden and began to become fuel. It was uncomfortable, it was intense, but it was necessary. He was at his lowest point, but this was exactly the place from which he could begin to rise. And strange as it seemed, there was something liberating in recognizing that there was nowhere left to run. Write in the comments, I know the weight of this ground. I want to see who has felt that moment when everything seemed to fall apart, but still found the strength to get back up. It was after that early morning on the cold ground that something began to change. He woke that morning with heavy eyes and a tired mind, but there was a kind of quiet clarity within him, as if he had crossed an invisible line. It still hurt, but now he felt he needed to find a way out. Something to give meaning to the weight he carried. He left home with no particular destination in mind, driving along the long, flat country roads. He passed farms, small towns, and roadside churches, until he stopped at a gas station for coffee. It was there that something seemingly simple happened. He heard a song playing on the radio. It was a slow song, with soft piano and a voice that seemed to speak exactly what he felt, as if someone had entered his mind and put into words everything he couldn't say. That song played in his head for the rest of the day. When he got home, he sat at the kitchen table, opened the notebook where he'd written, I'm still here, and began writing more. At first it was just broken sentences, jumbled memories, but gradually the words began to take on a rhythm. He scribbled, crossed out, rewrote, as if trying to organize the chaos within himself. At some point, he realized those words had a melody, a cadence that begged to be sung. He hadn't planned to write a song, but when he finished the first page, he realized he'd created something that sounded like lyrics. In the days that followed, this became his ritual. He would wake up early before everyone else, make coffee, and sit down with his notebook open. Each morning was a deep dive into himself. Writing became his way of giving voice to what was being bottled up. Each word was a confession, an attempt to forgive himself. And little by little, the previously silent house began to gain sound. First words spoken softly, then verses sung almost in a whisper. It was as if the walls were witnessing the transformation taking place before them. The most surprising thing was realizing how writing gave him a sense of relief. It was as if each song was an escape valve, lifting some of the weight he was carrying. This was his first major revelation. The pain didn't disappear, but transformed into something that could be seen from the outside. It was a way of saying, "This happened, this hurts, but now I can see." This new mindset was a turning point. He began to realize he could use what hurt him as raw material for something bigger. One day, almost without thinking, he recorded one of the verses he had written on his cell phone. Hearing his own voice, he felt something different. It wasn't just a song. It was a true portrayal of what he was feeling. That moment was powerful. For the first time, he saw himself not just as someone trying to survive, but as someone creating something with impact. That recording was proof that there was still life within him, that he was still capable of transforming suffering into beauty. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this was the true turning point. When he realized he could transform tears into lyrics, pain into song, the world around him began to change too. What was once just a dark room became a makeshift healing studio. Each song that emerged revealed a hidden part of himself. It was almost like watching behind the scenes of his own soul being rebuilt. And little by little, what was simply a way of coping with suffering began to become a creative journey, a silent mission to transform what was broken into something that could touch others. Write in the comments, "My pain has a melody." I want to know who out there has felt like they've found a way to transform what was stuck in their chest into something that makes sense. Each new lyric he wrote seemed to lift a stone from his chest. Music became his safe place, a territory where he could be honest without fear of judgment. When he sat with his notebook in front of him, there were no rules or expectations, just the sound of the words fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that was finally beginning to make sense. At first, he still cried with each verse, and those tears became part of the melody. It was as if the crying and the sound blended, creating something cleansing inside, a silent catharsis no one else saw. This was his greatest discovery. He no longer needed to fight what he felt. He could transform it into art. Mornings took on a new meaning. Before, he dreaded the sunrise because it meant facing another day, another string of obligations, more forced smiles. Now it was different. He would wake up and feel the urge to sit down and write, to discover what memories would surface that morning. There was something almost spiritual about the process, as if each song were a prayer, a silent dialogue with everything that had happened. And the more he wrote, the more he realized he wasn't just talking about what he saw in the war, but also about what he was discovering about himself. The first few months were intense. He composed like a breath, sometimes writing 3 or 4 songs a week. It wasn't about creating something perfect. It was about surviving, giving shape to chaos. Some lyrics felt like cries of despair, and others had the sweetness of a good memory that resisted destruction. This balance helped him see that life wasn't just pain. There were good memories that deserved to be remembered, and turning them into music helped him reclaim who he was before everything happened. It was a journey of self-discovery, a deep dive into layers he'd avoided for so long. Little by little, he began to notice the impact of this process on his mindset. His anxiety attacks diminished, and his sleepless nights became less frequent. He still had nightmares, but now he knew what to do when he woke up. He turned on the light, wrote a few lines, and turned that moment into something productive. This was one of the greatest revelations of his journey. What had previously been mere suffering became fuel for creating something new. He began to feel like he had regained some control, that he was no longer a hostage to his memories. This process also changed the way he viewed the people around him. Before, he avoided contact, fearing questions, pitying looks, or the pressure to get over it. Now, even without telling his whole story, he felt he could open up a little more. In conversations with friends, he began talking about music, sharing snippets of lyrics, and to his surprise, they became emotional. Some said they could relate, even without having lived through the war. It was then that he understood something profound. His pain, transformed into song, ceased to be just his and became a bridge to others. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because it was precisely at this point that the process stopped being just personal and began to have a greater impact. He realized that each song had the power to reach someone who might be going through the same internal struggle, even if in a different way. It was as if each verse was an invitation for others to see their own story and somehow find the courage to talk about it. This was a shift in mindset, from seeing pain as something isolating to seeing it as something that could generate connection. This transformation helped him rebuild his relationship with life itself. He began to notice the little things: the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of birds in the backyard, the feeling of the wind on his face when he went for a walk. Before, all of this went unnoticed. Now it was as if every detail was a reminder that he was still alive. Music had restored something precious: the ability to feel again, to be present in the moment, without being constantly dragged back to the past. The behind the scenes of this change wasn't easy. There were days when he considered giving up, when he felt like nothing made sense. But it was precisely on those days that he wrote his most intense songs, the ones that would later become listeners' favorites. Each failure became raw material for a new composition, and this gave him the feeling that nothing was wasted, not even pain. This was one of his greatest lessons. Everything could be transformed. Write in the comments. My tears have already spoken for me. I want to know who has experienced that moment when crying was the only language available, and then found a way to transform it into something that brought relief. At first, the idea of sharing those songs with anyone seemed impossible. They were too intimate, as if each verse were a confession, an open scar transformed into sound. He thought, if anyone hears this, they'll see too much of me. But at the same time, a restlessness was growing within him. Writing and singing alone was no longer enough. It was as if the songs were begging to be shared with the world, to find ears that could hear them. This tension grew until it became unbearable. One Saturday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee growing cold beside him, he looked at his notebook full of lyrics and felt a mixture of fear and urgency. It was as if this was the moment of a decision: continue hiding what he felt or risk being seen. He stared at the notebook for hours until he finally picked up his guitar. He played one of the most painful songs, his voice cracking, and decided to record it on his phone. It took several attempts because his hands were shaking, and with each mistake, he considered giving up. But deep down, he knew that if he didn't record it then, he might never have the courage to do it again. When he finished recording, he stood still for a few seconds, just breathing. It was a simple video, unedited, without a professional microphone, just him, his guitar, and the weight of everything he felt. And that's exactly how he decided to post it. He didn't write a long explanatory text. He didn't provide any context. He simply clicked publish and let the music speak for itself. His heart felt like it was pounding in his throat. For hours, he didn't want to look at his phone. He went for a walk, tried to occupy his mind, but the anxiety returned with every passing minute. That night, he finally worked up the courage to open his notifications. What he found left him speechless. Comments began to appear. People I'd never seen before writing things like, "This song feels like it was made for me," or "I needed to hear this exactly today." There were messages of thanks, reports of people saying they cried listening to it, that they felt understood for the first time in months. It was as if a door had opened. This was the first time in a long time that he felt something good could come from what he'd experienced. The next day, he woke up early and recorded another song. This time, the anxiety was still there, but there was also a spark of excitement. He wanted to see how far this could go. Each new song seemed to reach more people. He received private messages from other veterans, sharing their own stories of struggle. Some said they also wrote but had never shared it with anyone. Others confessed they were thinking about giving up, and that these songs reminded them that there was still something worth fighting for. Little by little, he began to realize that the process wasn't just about him. It was about creating a space where others could feel safe to speak out. This understanding was transformative. If before shame had made him hide his feelings, now he began to see vulnerability as strength. That's what made people connect with his music. The raw honesty, without masks, without trying to appear strong. He was showing the backstage of his own soul, and that had an impact. A friend, also a musician, invited him to play at a small local cafe. The idea of performing live terrified him. He almost refused, but after a few days of deliberation, he decided to accept. The day of the performance arrived, and he spent the entire afternoon restless, his hands sweating, his heart racing. When he stepped onto the small stage and saw people staring at him, he felt as if the air had grown heavy. But when he began to play, something changed. His voice was shaky in the first few verses, but gradually it became stronger. At the end of the song, the audience's silence was broken by applause, and some people were visibly moved. At that moment, something inside him broke, not in the sense of destruction, but of liberation. He realized he no longer needed to hide his story. Each performance was a way to share the weight he carried, to transform the pain into something that could generate hope. He returned home that night feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: lightness. In the following months, he began participating in other events. They weren't big concerts, but smaller gatherings, open mic nights, places where the music had a space to be truly heard. Each time he sang, he realized he was becoming more confident, more whole. And it wasn't just about improving technically or overcoming stage fright, but about allowing himself to be seen for who he truly was. This shift in mindset was decisive. He no longer saw vulnerability as weakness, but as an act of courage. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this moment of showing himself to the world was more than an artistic act. It was an act of healing. By sharing his songs, he was telling himself that he was no longer a hostage to silence. Each song he sang was like opening a window and letting in fresh air after years of closed doors. Fear still lingered, but it no longer held the same power. There was a new kind of strength emerging from it, a strength built on honesty, on truth exposed without embellishment. And the more he opened up, the more he found people who were also ready to do the same. Write in the comments, "My voice needs to be heard." I want to know who else feels they carry something that deserves to be heard, whether in words, art, or any form of expression that releases what's been bottled up. Over time, he began to realize that the songs were no longer just about surviving the day, but about rekindling a sense of presence. After each performance, there were lingering hugs, hands that trembled as they thanked him, looks that said, "You spoke for me." In rural community centers, in public school auditoriums, in churches with wooden pews and the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the scene repeated itself. A silent line formed, and with each person, a whole story awaited to be told. One mother said her 15-year-old son had stopped talking about anxiety since the pandemic, but upon hearing those lyrics about waking up in the middle of the night and taking deep breaths until his heart slowed, he asked to talk. A father, a veteran of another generation, said he spent decades pretending everything was fine, and that song was his first permission to cry without shame. The impact was visible not in numbers but in simple gestures. The crumpled handkerchief, the shy smile, the head nodding. I get it. He began carrying a worn cover notebook to every event. In it, he jotted down names, dates, and fragments of stories he received. They were short lines. Seattle, mother and son, talk about fear of sirens. Ohio, teacher, requested music for graduation. Texas, couple, play at support group on Saturdays. It wasn't a fetish for pain. It was a commitment to the hidden truth of the process. Healing isn't an end point. It's a series of small, persistent decisions. Gradually, his calendar filled with invitations that didn't always involve a stage. He was invited to a writing circle at a veterans hospital, to a gathering in a school gymnasium, where he spoke with parents and teenagers about naming feelings, to a conversation circle in a community hall, where there were only metal chairs, cold light, and courage. In each space, the same revelation. When someone has the courage to put their pain into words, others find language for their pain too. There was a Saturday in autumn that definitively marked this transition. At a town fair with banners strung between yellow trees, he stood on a small makeshift stage next to a lemonade stand. The music was simple, the wind rustled the lyrics, and children ran between stands selling apple pie and team jerseys. He played Learning to Dawn, and at the end a 9-year-old girl came with her mother. The child held a scribbled sign and said, "My aunt came back from the war different. When you sing, it seems she feels lighter." The mother explained that in the evenings everyone would sit around the table and listen to a song before talking about the day. The song had become a family ritual, a way to open conversations that hadn't happened before. In that moment, he understood that the lyrics had crossed the border of the individual and encountered the real life of ordinary American homes. Hurried dinners, bills to pay, rides to practice, school reports, and yet, a space to breathe together. The transformation didn't erase the hazy days. There were mornings when his body remembered the old tension. The sound of an exhaust could still set off internal alarms. But his mindset had changed. Instead of running away, he'd find his guitar, sit on the porch step, and let his fingers find a chord that would sustain his heart until it passed. He discovered that discipline is also healing. Drinking water, walking around the block, texting a friend who asks, "Have you eaten today?" Responding to emails from parents asking for tips on talking to their children. None of this is heroic. It's everyday. And it was in the everyday that he began to overcome. The behind the scenes of these victories had their own rituals. Before taking the stage, he would close his eyes and quietly repeat 3 phrases he had learned in a support group. I am here. I am safe. I can feel. It seemed too simple, but it served as an anchor. Amidst cables, microphones, and chairs, he remembered that courage is not the absence of fear. It is decision. And decision, he learned, is a muscle. The more you exercise it, the easier it becomes to lift the weight the next day. In this realization lay an unexpected freedom. He didn't need to win forever, he just needed to choose well today. The messages kept coming, and many came from parents struggling with emotional health at home. My son doesn't want therapy. Your music is the only thing he'll listen to, wrote a Minnesota mother. How do I talk to my daughter without sounding like I'm demanding? Asked a North Carolina father. He wasn't a therapist and always made that clear, but he knew he could offer what he had. Accessible language, honest examples, a welcoming environment. He began preparing short guides to hand out at events. Conversation starting questions. What was the hardest part of your day? Simple practices. 3 breaths with your feet touching the floor. And at the end, a blank space for each family to create their own self-care ritual. It wasn't about formulas. It was about presence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because something essential shifted in his identity. He stopped seeing himself solely as a survivor, and began to recognize himself as a guardian of stories, not in the grandiose sense, but in the daily care of holding others' pain with respect. The focus was no longer on getting over it quickly, but on sustaining processes. He understood that not everyone wants a platform. Many just want an uninterrupted ear. And so on a Tuesday night, in a borrowed library room, a small monthly circle was born. Chairs in a circle, a guitar leaning against the shelf, a box of tissues in the center. There, veterans, parents, teachers, truck drivers, nurses, and teenagers sat side by side to share whatever fit in a song, a poem, or silence. No social media, no clicks, no rush. One such night, a white-haired man brought an envelope filled with old photos and said he hadn't spoken about a friend who hadn't returned for 50 years. He opened the envelope with trembling hands, showed the photo, took a deep breath, and asked for a song, the kind that helps you get through. The guitar responded with slow chords, and the entire room leaned in to listen not to the perfection of the melody, but to the truth of that moment. It was then that he realized another revelation. Sometimes the most important song isn't the one you compose, but the one you offer as a soundtrack for someone to say what they've never said. Art is shelter. Music is a bridge. There were also unexpected invitations. An interview on a local radio station on Veterans Day, a participation in a school assembly where principals wanted to talk about mental health without scaring parents, a meeting on a basketball court converted into an auditorium. He began to see the journey through the lens of service. It wasn't about career, it was about usefulness. In each place, the same question guided him. How can this song help today? Sometimes it was singing. Sometimes it was silent. Sometimes it was directing someone to a more structured support network. He learned not to center everything on himself, to build bridges with those who had been doing this work for decades. With this shift in mindset, his writing also matured. His lyrics began to carry not only the weight of what was, but the tenderness of what could be. He spoke of small decisions that create the future, turning off your phone during dinner, listening without correcting, saying I'm sorry, without trying to fix everything immediately. He spoke of the hidden truth of grief, that there's no going back to normal, only learning a new normal. He spoke of the invisible impact of gestures, a note in the lunchbox, an I'm with you in a late-night text, a walk together without over-explaining. These were songs that fit into real lives. None of this put him on a pedestal. He still had days when the room would darken before sunset. The difference was that now he wasn't alone. He had a network. The friend who called, the therapist who asked, "Where do you feel this in your body?" The neighbor who knocked on the door with a pecan pie and said, "I ate half, I brought the rest." Above all, he had a commitment to a journey that didn't end with the last chord. And this commitment gave him a kind of quiet courage, the same that sustains a father and mother when the house is chaotic, and yet they take a deep breath and carry on. On a cold December night at a candlelight vigil in front of the town's memorial, he sang to a small crowd, thick coats, gloves, cups of hot chocolate, children leaning on their parents' shoulders. The song spoke of finding a way through the dark. When he finished, no one applauded immediately. There was a respectful silence, and then hugs, smiles, and deep breaths began. He put away his guitar and stood there, listening. A woman leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for reminding us that we can still cross." He thought perhaps this was the phrase he'd been searching for since day one. On the way home, the passenger seat was littered with notes people had left. Quick words, children's drawings, support group phone numbers, invitations to return. He spread them all out on the table and stared at them in silence. The past was still the past with its shadows and holes, but now another narrative was possible, that of someone who chose to build bridges where, before, there had been only walls. And as he ran his fingers through the pages, he felt a new melody approaching, simple and honest, like someone asking permission to be born, not as closure but as another step in this patient construction he had learned to call life in progress. Write in the comments, "I'm still rebuilding myself." He realized that, deep down, that entire journey had transformed him into something far greater than he could have imagined when it all began. There were days, long ago, when he believed the pain had only come to destroy him, that the world had lost its luster, and that nothing would ever make sense again. Today, sitting on the porch with his guitar resting on his lap, he understood that the pain hadn't come to destroy him, but to shape him, to reveal something hidden. It was as if each scar were a line in an invisible score, and together they formed the melody of his life. This didn't mean he romanticized what he'd experienced, far from it, but now he knew that that very pain had become the raw material for his transformation. This understanding didn't come all at once. It took years of process, of sleepless nights, of torn pages, of songs rewritten 1,000 times, until they rang true. What he carried was too intense to be resolved with ready-made phrases or easy formulas. But each time he had the courage to revisit what happened, to look at what hurt without looking away, something in him grew stronger. It was like polishing a rough stone. Difficult, exhausting, but in the end it revealed something hidden beneath so many layers. That's how he discovered a hidden truth. Pain is a harsh teacher, but it's also the one that teaches us the most about who we truly are. The message he carried now wasn't about perfection or having all the answers. It was about presence, about not abandoning oneself even when everything seemed to be falling apart. He understood that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but a bridge to deeper connections, to honest dialogue, to the healing that happens when two people meet at the point of pain and decide not to run away. Every song he wrote, every conversation he had after a performance, every silent embrace exchanged at the end of an event, was proof that something good could be born from what seemed lost. In the United States, where so many families are on the run, trying to balance work, school, bills, and responsibilities, he began to realize the impact of stopping for a few minutes and simply speaking the truth. In conversation circles, he saw parents telling their children, "I get scared sometimes too," and teenagers breathing a sigh of relief when they realized they weren't alone. Small gestures, but they created safe spaces for life to be faced head-on. This was the most beautiful part of the transformation. It wasn't just happening to him, but to those around him. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is the essence of the message he shares today. Pain can, yes, destroy us if we hide it, if we let it grow in silence, but it can also transform us when we have the courage to bring it to light. Telling your story is an act of courage, but also a gift, to yourself and to those listening. How many people are in the dark, needing only a sign to believe they can get through? Maybe this is your story. Maybe this is your light. He always repeats that it's not about becoming an example, but about becoming a presence. Sometimes simply existing and saying, "I survived this," is enough for someone to decide to try another day. This realization changed the way he writes, the way he lives, the way he relates. It's not about erasing the past, but about integrating it into the present and letting it generate something new. It's about transforming a dark room into a room with a lit candle, where others can sit without fear. The message is clear. No one needs to carry everything alone. The story he tells today is proof that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That feeling pain isn't a sign of failure, it's a sign that you're alive. That sharing is a revolutionary act, because it breaks the cycle of silence that suffocates so many. The impact of this is profound. Every person who listens, identifies, and decides to speak out multiplies hope in the world. Write in the comments, "My pain has a voice." I want to know who feels ready to transform what they carry into something that can bring light to someone else. If everything you've heard so far resonated, perhaps you're feeling something in your chest right now. that mix of emotion and reflection that only emerges when a story finds us at the right moment. That's why I always say that this space we're creating together goes far beyond a video. Every person who stops by, who allows themselves to feel, who leaves a word or a piece of their story in the comments, helps build a place where talking about pain and transformation becomes something natural. That's the true impact of conversations like this. They don't end when the video ends, they continue in the exchange, in the sharing, in the courage to open our hearts. When you leave a comment, you're not just talking to me, but also to others who may be going through the same process and need to know they're not alone. It's a way of reaching out to someone who might be on the verge of giving up, just like they were at the beginning of this journey. That's the beauty of this movement. A simple, "I understand you," can be the push someone needs to keep trying. So, if this message resonated with you, write a word in the comments that represents how you felt. It can be something simple but true. This helps transform this space into a safe meeting place where every voice matters. And if you feel this story needs to be heard by more people, liking it is more than just a click. It's a way of telling the algorithm that this content deserves to reach others who also need to hear it. It's a small gesture, but one that can change someone's day. Think of each like as shining a light in a dark place, guiding someone who's still trying to find their way back. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what we're building here isn't just an audience. It's a community, a place where we don't have to constantly feign strength, where we can talk about new beginnings without shame, and transform our experiences into collective learning. Every time you interact, you reinforce this invisible network that connects stories, that supports each other when the ground seems to be falling apart. This is how we create a space of hope, a space where suffering isn't the end, but the beginning of something new. Write in the comments, "My tears are seeds." I want to know who is ready to transform what once hurt into something that makes hope blossom in the lives of others. If you've stuck with me this far, I think this story resonated with you in some way. So here's what you need to do. Like this video, because it's the simplest way to show that this conversation resonated and help this message reach others who need to hear it today. And if this content touched you, subscribe to the channel to continue following these inspiring stories that help us find strength even on the hardest days. Write in the comments, "I'm with you until the end." I'll love knowing that you stayed with me until the very last second, and that this reflection found a place in your heart. And if you'd like to continue this journey with me, there's a video right here that complements everything we talked about today. Click and join me for the next chapter. There's more for us to experience and reflect on together.